If you turn the news or scroll through social media in the recent months since the war with Iran started, all you hear from the extreme right and left is that Israel is the reason for this war. We are fighting the war for Israel. AIPAC made America fight the war. All of this is nonsense. Yes, Israel needed this war, but so does the US. There are global implications regarding this war that the US had to address. It starts with China, which had leverage in the Middle East that we'll discuss in this video. It goes through Iran itself, which really tried to create a nuclear weapon, unlike people like Tucker Carlson told you. And it ends with the US itself, where the US had to prove to itself that it has the military capacity for this war and to understand what are the deficits in terms of the US military and weapon production that the US needs to address. We'll also look how this war is really going and how I think it's going to end. In 2025, the US helped Israel to destroy the Natanz, Isfahan, and Fordow nuclear facilities in Iran. We all heard Trump talking about the B-2 bombers, the beautiful B-2 bombers that attacked using the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator bomb on the facilities in Iran. And then in 2026, US and Israel started Operation Epic Fury, or Roaring Lion in Israel. This is the Israeli name. People might ask, why would you attack Iran if you already removed the nuclear threat? The truth is, this nuclear threat had many parts. And Israel, since the start, pursued the goals of removing the nuclear threat, removing the proxy, and degrading the ballistic missiles. Now, allegedly, Israel persuaded the US to attack Iran to remove all these threats. But the truth is, the US itself wanted to remove some of these threats, since Israel is not the only one in the region. As we all remember, Trump visited the region around a year ago, and he visited Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and others, way before he went to Israel. All these countries are oil producers and strategic partners of the US in some aspects. And of course, the US also wanted to build data centers in them, and some of them already have them. So except for all the issues related to the strait, to the closure of the strait, that we discussed in another video, in the link below, there are other interests that the US has in the region. Now, if we take it together, on the one side, the Israeli interest, related to Iran itself, which by the way was the force behind the proxies that did the 7th of October, and the US itself, which has its own regions related to economy and strategic military alliances. These two align together and end in a common interest to fight Iran, because a nuclear Iran would have made this region a lot worse for Israel and the US, basically for the West, because a nuclear Iran would be immune to any attack from the US, like North Korea, which the Obama and Clinton administrations failed to prevent from having a nuclear weapon, and now, as you can see, they can do whatever they want and no one will do anything to them. And by the way, they have missiles that can reach California. Back in the day, some people in the US said, who cares about North Korea? It's far away. They don't have missiles that reach us. Well, eventually they do. And each day that passes by, their missiles are becoming a lot better. Same with Iran. They launched one missile through Diego Garcia, which is far away from Iran. They can reach London right now. So people say about it, Iran only made missiles for the Middle East, for Israel. And surprise, surprise, they have missiles that can reach London. Why do they need missiles that reach London? Are they fighting Europe? Of course not. Allegedly, they're not fighting Europe. But now they have the capability for some unknown reason. For the same reason, and even worse than that, since they chant death to America and death to Israel daily, they were making missiles that eventually would reach the US, and their final goal was to threaten the United States of America with a nuclear weapon. Now, Tucker Carlson told me, not personally, that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon program. So I checked it. After a little digging, I found out that Israel stole the nuclear archive from Iran. I think it was more than 10 years ago. And this archive, which was by the way stolen digitally and physically from Tehran, the capital of Iran, proved without any doubt that Iran had a nuclear weapon program. Now, more than that, the whole talk about the nuclear material that Iran has underground in the facilities that were bombed in Midnight Hammer, all of this nuclear material is enriched uranium to 60%. Now, if you will check it, you don't need 60% enriched uranium for anything in this world except for weapons. There is no use case for anything in 60% enriched uranium except for making nuclear weapons. So we have the archive, we have the proof, the uranium itself that Trump is saying by his own words is 60% enriched. You have to choose between Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, and the other anti-Israeli, pro-Qatari lobby, and your president. Believe whoever you want to, but as I think, I believe Trump. And the facts on the ground. There is another claim, which is ridiculous, that Iran made a fatwa, a religious ruling, saying that we cannot produce a nuclear weapon. To believe it is like believing in the Nigerian prince scam in your mail. Part of the strategy of Islamists, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, Qatar is a part of this organization, or Iran, is to lie in order to achieve goals in the holy war, in the jihad, as they call it. So they can do fatwas while at the same time enriching uranium, creating facilities that were bombed by the Israel and the US to create a nuclear trigger, right? The thing that triggers the reaction in the bomb. So you are doing a fatwa against creating a weapon while working on the weapon, and Israel and the US bombed the facilities with the weapon. So at the same time, people are believing this fatwa while the Israel and US telling you, your own army, your own military says, and president, that we bombed nuclear weapon facilities, okay? So we bombed these facilities and people are saying that no, there is no weapon. Of course, also Israel killed a lot of nuclear scientists and Iranian IRGC general, which was in charge of creating a nuclear weapon. His assassination is a very interesting Mossad operation. You should look it up. There was a usage of an automatic rifle, which was not shooting automatically, but literally automatic robot rifle from a car that was controlled from Israel. Now, if we take into account that Iran 100% was pursuing a nuclear weapon, and that we see that the US has its own interest in the region except for Israel, and we know that the US wants to keep the region safe for various economic and strategic reasons, let's sum it all up and understand that there was 100% interest by the US, except for the Israeli interest, that was aligned strategically with the Israeli interest. And that's okay, since we're fighting the war together, to fight Iran and to finish the job in terms of the nuclear weapons. So now is the 28th of May 2026. The Strait of Hormuz right now, as far as I know, is still closed. It's closed while Iran, as mentioned in the previous video, link below also, doesn't have a navy, as Trump likes to say, and he's right, doesn't have an air force. All they have left are speedboats, mines, and anti-ship missiles, and drones. And of course missiles, but I'm talking about shipping in the strait right now. If we take all this into account, and we see that Iran manages to block the strait, imagine what would they have done if they had a nuclear weapon. So their ultimate goal was to take the nuclear weapon and to blockade the strait at the same time. How do I know it? The blockade is well organized. They conducted it basically shortly after the war started. Since they managed to do it so fast and they had the facilities in place, you can assume that they had the plans for it, right? We know, we see it. So they had the plans to blockade the strait. And they had the plans for the nuclear weapon. Sum it all up, 1 + 1, right? And you have an Iranian extortion system where the US and the West can't do anything, since no one will attack a nuclear power, which is led by religious lunatics. And eventually, Iran would have extorted the world and controlled this strait indefinitely, as long as the regime exists. Who knows when it will fall, right? We can see North Korea. It's not really, they keep the regime. Everyone is in poverty. Everything is bad in there. But Kim Jong-un is still in power. So doing this war right now was critical for the US. And again, we're talking about a strait that has dozens of percentage from the world oil, fertilizers, gas, and other materials. And we also know that Iran planned to move the drone, nuclear, and missile facilities underground. Currently, they have missiles underground and drones underground. But the production itself, including the nuclear weapon facilities, everything was above the ground. This is what Israel and the US destroyed. So right now, Israel and the US managed to completely eradicate the Iranian factories. So Iran can't produce new missiles. Maybe they can produce some drones. It's pretty easy. But they can produce missiles and they can produce nuclear weapons. And their plan was to move it underground. This is why Israel and the US decided to attack right now, before it's too late. Also take into account that we have the midterms in November, and who knows if the Democrats will come to power. And if the Democrats will be in power, most likely they won't let Trump or try to prevent him in any way possible from any military campaign, even if it's in the interest of the United States, since the politics in the US are very divided and they can't almost agree on anything. Another thing that Iran could have done with a nuclear weapon is to basically give an umbrella to its proxies, Hezbollah, Houthis, and others. Now, you would say, okay, who cares, it's not our war. And you might be right, but let's say that Israel fights Hezbollah or Hamas or the Houthis after they attack Israel. Now let's say Iran sends a nuclear weapon on Tel Aviv. Let's say it detonates. Then you have Tel Aviv gone and all you groypers will be happy. Okay, but Israel will retaliate. Israel, unlike Tucker or Fuentes think, we are not Al Mossad. Right? We don't know if Israel has a nuclear weapon or not, but let's say it has. Israel would have retaliated, and then you would have a nuclear war. Now, who says that it would have ended there? Maybe now nuclear weapons are like regular weapons. Everyone can use them because Israel is using them right now and Iran is using them right now. So let's finish the job here and finish all the old conflicts. For example, India and Pakistan, they have nuclear weapons. And now that Israel and Iran is fighting nuclear, they can also start it. What's the problem? And then you would have a nuclear global war. This is of course not 100% chance that it would have happened, but it raises up the possibilities a lot. So to sum up this whole thing with the nuclear weapons, there is no scenario in the world where the US is interested or benefits from a nuclear Iran. Actually, no one in the world benefits from nuclear Iran. Even the countries that support Iran are not benefiting from it. This is a catastrophe, and someone needed to prevent it. And since only the US and Israel currently in the West are capable of fighting and are willing to fight and basically are not completely rotten, we are the ones that did it. And this is 100%, as I proved you, an interest of the Western civilization and in particular the United States of America. Now let's talk about China, as Trump says. So China invested in Iran for a long time. They have a strategic cooperation allegedly around 300 or 400 billion dollars. The numbers are not really important here. But for all this time, while there are sanctions on Iran, Iran used its shadow fleet to move oil to China, while China bought this oil, of course, from Iran with some discount. So China and Iran had this oil for money, that's nice. But at the same time, China invested in Iran in terms of military capacity. China gave Iran the equipment to create, for example, the ballistic missiles. Not really the ballistic missiles themselves, some of it is from China, but mostly the fuel for the ballistic missiles. So China helped Iran in terms of anti-air missiles, and China helped Iran with censorship. For example, some of you may have heard, the Iranian internet was blocked since the start of the war. Actually, right now it opened a little, like these days. Sorry, it was closed even before the war when they tried to do an uprising there. So the tech to basically blockade the internet, to enable mass surveillance, to control people, was imported from China. So China helped facilitate the Iranian regime oppression, basically. In return for all of this, except for money, China gets the Iranian proxy network in the region in order to basically control, in some manner as we see, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the Strait of Hormuz. Bab el-Mandeb is in the Red Sea. It's influenced by the Houthis, which are proxy of Iran in Yemen, and Iran itself in the Persian Gulf, in the Strait of Hormuz. So we have two straits, and China can basically, in some manner, control the sea, like the US is supposed to do after the world order that was established post-World War II. So China can now tell Iran, you let Chinese vessels and Russian ships go through the Strait of Hormuz and through Bab el-Mandeb, but prevent others, prevent American, Israeli, Western, whatever, or extort them for money. While they do it, the US is tying down ships and other military assets to the Middle East, while removing them from the Indo-Pacific and basically moving military assets from China itself. This is why Trump, in a pretty interesting manner, negated the effect of Iran in the Strait of Hormuz by blockading their blockade. Instead of letting China and Iran control the situation, Trump took the situation and inverted it and said, okay, we're blockading you completely and everyone else can go. So now they have the problem which they didn't foresee. Going back to the countries that are regional partners of the US in the Persian Gulf and the Middle East, China also wants to have influence in this region. So Iran is the way to get inside the region. By threatening countries through Iran, they can basically move them by extortion, by threats, to the Chinese axis. Since if the US won't come to help, it will be beneficial for them to switch to another axis and basically divide the world again to a bipolar world order, like when the Soviet Union fought the US. So part of the removal of the US hegemony is to take over the Middle East. Of course, they want to take over other regions also, for example, South America, which is why Trump is threatening Cuba right now and removed Maduro from Venezuela. But this is a topic for another video. Going back to the Middle East, the US world marine hegemony and basically hegemony is threatened by China, and Iran is the means to facilitate it. China even realized some of this power when they facilitated through peace agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It was before the war, and basically took the role of the United States as the mediator, as the country that always stands between rival countries and says, okay, that's enough, you need to make peace. By the way, this is why Trump is so proud of all the achievements he did when he says that I ended 8 wars. This is exactly the strategic global role of the United States of America. This is why Trump needs these achievements to show that the US is still the world hegemony, still the all-powerful country. So going back to the role that China played between Saudi Arabia and Iran, this undermines the US control of the world, the US hegemony, and the US can't accept it because again, the US tries to be the world hegemon and the US reserve currency. So if we connect it all together and we take into account again that China buys the oil from Iran, if we remove this free flow of discounted oil from Iran to China, and if we take over again the hegemony of the region, and if we take over the maritime trade again, we are basically negating the effects, the whole effects that China made on the region. And we are removing some oil that China desperately needs, because unlike the US, China produces only 4 or 5 million barrels of oil per day, while they consume around 14. So China cannot fight without enough oil, even with their reserves. Eventually they will run out. So the US takes over this region again, takes over the maritime trade, and removes some strategic assets from China, while also keeping the world hegemony, while also removing the ability of China to conduct warfare in some manner, which threatens, of course, Taiwan and US allies in the Indo-Pacific. During Operation Epic Fury, Israel and the US proved that the Chinese weapons and the Russian weapons are inferior. Unlike what you have been told in the news, the most advanced anti-aircraft missiles all failed against US and Israeli weapons. Now, of course, some planes were taken down and some drones were taken down. By the way, taking down a drone is not an achievement, it's pretty easy. But taking down planes like F-15, if they fly low, it's not also such an achievement. It's something that was expected. Now, all of this still proves that the US and Israeli weapons are superior. No doubt about it. But Iran had one advantage, which they try to maximize, which is basically their cheap drones, as we all know, the Shahed drones, which are used also in Russia against Ukraine, and their ballistic missiles, the long range and the medium range, the ones that they are using basically against the Gulf countries and Israel. So these missiles are not sophisticated. There is nothing sophisticated, nothing new about them. They are pretty standard, but the amount, the sheer amount of them, and the fact that they store them, in underground facilities. These facilities are fortified against the best US and Israeli weapons. And what Israel and the US did to all of them is just basically bombed the entrances, which by now most of them are already dug out. So they removed the blockade of these entrances. And the whole strategy was to take the truck, come out of the entrance for the facility, launch a missile, and then go back. This is basically the whole idea. Iran managed with this strategy to keep the war going, because if not for these bases in mountains, which again they tried to eventually move their factories also into, if not for them, Iran would not have had any luck in this war. they would have been defeated long ago. Israel and the US used advanced missiles, such as THAAD missile, which is an anti-ballistic missile used by the US, or SM-2, SM-3 missiles, which are also used by the US, and Israeli Arrow and David Sling missiles. All of these are against short, medium, and long-range ballistic missiles. The issue with all of them is that they are very expensive. Now, the Iranian ballistic missiles that they are shooting to Israel are also expensive, but Iran doesn't really have an economy. They're not functioning. There is no welfare. The life there is pretty hard, and they don't really care about their people. They even kill them in the streets, right? They use all of their money to build the military. They have only one thing in mind, which is how do we eradicate the infidels. Unlike Tucker is telling you, they are not reasonable people. They only want to fight. Again, the US used and Israel used all these sophisticated, really good weapons, which are better than anything that Russia or China produces, but they're very expensive. An SM-3 missile, I think, costs around $20 million. You cannot fight cheap weapons with very expensive ones. Especially the Gulf countries use Patriot missiles, PAC-3, against Shahed drones. Like it's $1 million or something like this missile against a drone that costs $10,000 or $20,000, like nothing. Okay, so what this war proved is that the US manufacturing capacity and the Israeli manufacturing capacity, but we are now talking about the US, is basically not enough. The US can't produce enough advanced missiles to fight, for example, against China. More than that, it's hard for them to protect the Gulf countries from an attack by Iran. The reason for all of this is that the US basically exported all of its manufacturing capacity to China, which, by the way, was noted long ago by the Pentagon as a strategic threat. Since if you might fight China and at the same time you export your weapon industry to China, you are not going to fight them. You won't be able to fight a country where you manufacture the weapons to fight it, right? It's completely nonsense. Partially, the reason for that will be elaborated in a video that I will make soon, so subscribe. And in this video, I will basically explain how the US role as a reserve currency hollowed out its manufacturing capacity and how it made you, the average American, feel poor. In a high level, we're talking about the role of the US in the world as a reserve currency. So US exported the manufacturing capacity in order to facilitate its own debt and the role of the reserve currency. If you think about it, the whole world is manufacturing things, and the US is the largest consumer market by far. So the US consumer market is importing all the goods. They pay the countries with dollars. And these dollars, they can't store them indefinitely, right? What can you do with the dollar? There is inflation, as we all know. So what they're doing with these dollars is basically buying US treasuries, which is US debt, or US assets, such as stocks, propping up the stock market. So, or of course, other US assets, real estate, anything that they can buy. So the US is getting back the dollars that it exported to buy the goods. So this is the trade, basically. Now, if you do it, it's very beneficial to produce everything outside. It all connects also to weapons. The US is not producing enough weapons. Now you will say, why do I need to produce weapons? I don't want to go to war. If you want to keep the US as the world hegemon and the world reserve currency, you must produce weapons. You must be able to fight. You cannot let your adversaries take the strategic role of the US. Because if they do, you will lose eventually the reserve currency. And how do I know it? Since at one time, England, the British Empire, was the world hegemon. And their currency, the pound, was basically the reserve currency. And before that, Holland, the Netherlands, and other countries, Spain, and they all lost the hegemony and lost the currency. And in the future video, you will find out what would happen if the US will lose the reserve currency. Now, going back to the good news here, Trump and his administration understood that this is a gap, and this thing will basically revive the US industrial capacity in terms of weapons. So Trump is always talking about how he wants to bring industries back to the US, which is one of the reasons for the tariffs that he made on other countries. It's not only to threaten them, it's to make things more expensive there in order to move them to the US, since when you produce inside, you are basically benefiting, the workers inside the country are benefiting, and you won't feel so poor, right? So this will boost domestic production of weapons, and the US eventually will close this gap. Also, the war proved that you can't fight always with expensive weapons against, as I've said, against cheap ones. So right now, the US and Israel are making huge efforts to create laser weapons. Some of them are already operational, but they are in the early stages, that are very cheap to operate, cost a lot less, and can destroy many of these threats with basically almost no cost. Like it costs around $10 per shot, something like this, which is nothing for a military, especially compared to a $30 million missile like the SM-3. So as we all see, the world is more complicated than just Israel, the Jews, and all of it. We have other issues. We have a global strategical interest of the United States, and this web of interests include the Middle East, even if it's far from you, even if you think it's not affecting you, which I proved it does in several videos already. This is a definite US interest, and this is a definite interest because the US is the global superpower still and the world hegemon, and it cannot afford any region in the world to be dominated by other players, or it will start losing its place in the world. If the US will isolate itself, it will eventually have much more severe internal and economic problems, since there are benefits in being the world hegemon and reserve currency. So when this war started, Trump said that he wants to prevent a nuclear Iran. He wants to prevent them from funding the proxies. He wants to prevent them from creating ballistic missiles and drones. Now, after these months of fighting and ceasefire, the real goal here is to remove the nuclear weapon capability. Once the US will safely, in this way or another, either military or by agreement, which is unlikely, will get the enriched uranium, basically we can finish this war. I don't know if Iran will stop with the extortion and try and agree to finish the war, but this should be the end game. Regarding the proxies and ballistic missiles, both of them were severely degraded. Iran cannot already transfer most of its weapons to the proxies since it doesn't have a navy and an air force, and they lost all their ballistic missile factories. Now, probably they will rebuild them. What the US and Israel should do, create better weapons to negate them. Lasers, more sophisticated and cheaper missiles. So Iran must be prevented from having a nuclear weapon. And regarding the other things, this is an open question, but I'm not so optimistic about it. Either way, unlike some people tell you, the US and Israel already achieved a tactical victory in this war. The strategic victory will be getting the nuclear materials. If you liked my analysis, please do me the favor and subscribe to the channel. Goodbye.